let's take that statement, I believe in God. For me, that can be taken in two ways, the focus being on believe. Either I believe in God like I believe in humanity. When I say that, I don't mean like there's a thing called humanity. I mean, there's a thing which I'm putting my hope in. There's something that I trust, i.e. humanity. But obviously there's a second way of taking that statement, which is I believe that this thing exists, like the concept of humanity or God. And so when you say you're an existentialist believer in God, I think you probably fall into that first category, that you take the leap of faith towards God. You trust God. You put your belief in God in that way, rather than making the propositional claim, there is some concrete entity that is satisfied and is true and described in the proposition there as a perfect being who's conscious, powerful, good, and the like. Do you think that's a fair characterization of the distinction?
Well, I have a hard time understanding exactly how to get to the second without thoroughly dispensing with the first, or thoroughly arranging the first properly. So let me respond to that in a way that also addresses another issue that you brought up. So you said with regards to Jacob's ladder, and I described this like infinite upward climb, let's say, at least of human beings. You said, well, there has to be something at the top. So let me describe for a moment how I think that's dealt with, at least in part, in the combined Old Testament and New Testament canons. And I'll make reference, I think, primarily to the concept of the Logos. So there's an insistence in Christianity that, and Christ himself makes this claim, that he's the embodiment of the prophet and the laws. And this is it's a very interesting claim technically, because what you have in the Old Testament, and you already alluded to this, is a series of characterizations of God. Like it's not all the Old Testament is, but the narrative part of it is a sequence of characterizations of God. It's sort of like there's a human being in this situation, and this is what God appears like to him or her. And then there's a human being in this situation, and this is how God appears to him or her. And so the God of the Tower of Babel is characterized in a different manner than the God in the story of the flood. There's an underlying insistence that these are all manifestations of the same transcendent reality, but the characterizations differ. Now, there's a pattern across those characterizations. Now, Christ's claim is that he's the physical embodiment of that pattern. And it's an extremely interesting claim. I have a very difficult time dispensing with it, let's say, on rational grounds. And this is an answer to the definition of what's at the pinnacle, at least insofar as that might be comprehensible by human beings, because Christ, like Job, is the mortal man who says yes to existence in the most radical possible manner. And so you to understand that, you have to take apart in some sense what that radical acceptance would mean if it was truly radical. And what it would mean is something like what was initially outlined in the story of Job. So Job is a good man by God's own testimony, and God essentially turns him over to the powers of evil so that they can have their way with him. And there's historical precedent for that idea, because Cain invites in Lucifer to have his way with him. This is something that happens in the Old Testament canon, but in the case of Job, Job doesn't invite Satan in. God basically sicks Satan on him. And then everything that can possibly happen that's terrible to a person happens to Job. Not everything, but it's a close approximation. And Job's response, Job has two responses. Like, he's so tortured that his wife says to him, there's nothing left for you to do except shake your fist at the sky, curse God, and die. And she has reason, viewing his misery, to make that claim. And part of the claim, and this would be relevant to the discussion we will have about notions of the evil God, it's like Job is pushed past what you might regard as reasonable mortal limits. But he does two things that are extremely interesting. He refuses under great duress to lose faith in the essential nature of his being. So he says to his friends and to God, he says, look, I'm not a perfect man. I have the imperfections of a good man. But that doesn't mean that I'm deserving of the existential catastrophe that has visited me. It isn't a mere cause and effect consequence. There's an arbitrariness about it. And so I don't lose faith in myself as a being, no matter what happens to me, but I also simultaneously don't lose faith in the divine itself, even though all the evidence in front of me at the moment suggests that life is nasty, brutish, and short, and perhaps even unforgivable in its evil. Now, what happens in the Christian story, in the Passion, is that story of Job is magnified across virtually all conceivable dimensions, so that Christ is the archetypal figure who faces the worst life has to offer by definition, but also throws himself fully open to that. And so you might say, well, that's what it means to that he takes the sins of the world unto himself. So imagine that the proper pattern of being for a human being is radical, open-armed acceptance of fate. Not just acceptance, but welcoming. But then imagine, because the insistence there, it's a very interesting idea, is that the more radical you are in that willingness, the more what the Old Testament thinkers characterized as the Spirit of God is likely to dwell within you and walk with you through your trials. And I can tell you, as a clinician, I can't see a flaw in that argument, because one of the things we've learned in the clinical realm is that if you encourage people to face the terrible things that they're tempted to avoid, that their character develops radically and they become much stronger. And that's been discovered across all the fields of clinical endeavor.
I think this might be the point where we find some interesting disagreement. I think we've been getting along like brothers so far, but those brothers might turn out to be Cain and Abel when I give a couple of clarifications here. Is that it seems like your argument there is like there is one of putting faith in the divine, in believing in the sense I gave a moment ago, to trust and place your hope into something, in God in this example, despite evidence to the contrary, you might think, or despite punishment from a God who claims they are perfectly good. And that seems like an existential claim, and I believe it is an existential claim. But you put them the other way around a moment ago. You said, I can't imagine the first idea of belief I gave you I can't imagine the second idea of belief I gave you without the first, i.e. you thought that without believing in, putting in the trust or the hope in something, then you couldn't have the latter. But I think it's the other way around. I think you need to know that this thing exists before you put your belief or hope in it. And so you could think of an example, right? Like, I believe in Santa Claus, i.e. I believe that Santa Claus will punish naughty children and be good to the good children, the children on his nice list. And you might think that's a reasonable thing to say I believe in, but it's not. There is such a thing called Santa Claus that exists. So it seems like you do need the latter there. Now, I have a couple of problems.
Might be this, eh?
Yeah,
that might be a dance.
Deeply related. There is certainly a dance if you take them both to be true, but I don't think you want to commit to the second one. So I don't think you can dance the dance that you want to. I think there's one person tangoing in that scenario. There's only I believe in God and make the jump. There's no and the proposition that God exists is true. You don't say that one. So I don't think you're welcome on God's dance floor, let's say. But
I have a hard time with what people who ask that question. People ask that question as if the statement exist is self-evident. It's weird, eh? Like, because when you're putting together a statement and one of the objects of the statement or the subjects of the statement is the ineffable unity of all things, you just can't cram another word in there like exists without introducing an equal mystery, because you're trying to make an equation, right? Does God have the properties of something that exists? It's like, well, you already have an implicit notion of what existence constitutes. It's part and parcel of the structure that's enabling you to ask that question. And I don't know what your theology of existence means. So when you say to me, I don't mean you specifically, but I could mean you too. It's like, does God exist? It's like, well, what's your conception of exist? I mean, that's what we're bandying about to some degree, right? It's the thing that's at the top of Jacob's ladder. Okay, well, that's not the same thing as a table. Right?
Well,
It's a different kind of existence.
If you've listened to us for a while, you know our stance on fluoridation. Today, more than 70% of the U.S. population has fluoride added to their water sources. That's a violation of personal rights, plain and simple. On the Jordan Peterson podcast, you've heard the government has no problem with mass medicating their populations without consent. On this show, we refuse to drink compromised water, and that's why we use Cove Pure. Cove Pure is a countertop reverse osmosis system that filters your water in 4 stages, stripping away fluoride, contaminants, and the arrogance of bureaucrats who think they know what's best for you. Their ClearWave reverse osmosis technology is lab certified to remove up to 99% of impurities, leaving you with only the purest water possible. And unlike the government, Cove Pure lets you have the water exactly the way you want it. It's the simple touchscreen that lets you choose the exact amount or temperature that you want. Hot, cold, warm. Cove Pure does it all with an instant tap of a button. Not only does it look amazing, the best part is there's no need to drill in pipes or call in the plumber. You just set Cove Pure right on your countertop, fill it up with water, and plug it in. Your health shouldn't come at the cost of your autonomy. Purify your water today with the same system that Jordan uses. And because we partnered with Cove Pure, you'll get $200 off if you use our link in our description box. covepure.com/Jordan.
There is something which is in the world, physical or non-physical, that fits that description. You might have a Wittgensteinian idea from the Tractatus, although it's outdated, that my language literally maps onto something that exists in reality. It doesn't need to be a physical entity. I can speak of conceptual entities like sets and numbers and the like. I can speak of things that I can conceive of existing non-physically, like souls and angels and God. So there are discussions to be had there, and an interesting one perhaps in terms of what we mean by exist. Why do we say that Harry Potter does not exist, but that God does exist, if we don't know what the word exists means? Like, there is something, though, call it exist or call it, I don't know, the gist, like give it whatever label you want. There is something that separates Harry Potter from God in the view of the Christian. They're not the same sorts of things. And I think that's important. Now, we can have a discussion about what that thing is, but I don't think we need to examine every tree to make our way out of the forest. We know generally what we mean by exist. I've said that God is the perfect being, and we both have a broad idea of what that might be. And to believe, we've pulled apart together 2 types of belief: to believe in and to believe that proposition's true. So on believing in God, trust and faith, Job's leap of faith, and yours as well, perhaps, is that it doesn't seem like that's consistent with an authentic existence in which one accepts the truth. I believe that one of your rules in your successful book is tell the truth and at least don't lie. And perhaps that starts with getting your own house in order first, that when you look in the mirror, you should tell yourself what's true and not believe in things that you don't know are true. Because if you don't know they're true, then you should suspend judgment on those things. And that's strongly my view. I'm an agnostic about being agnostic, and I'm almost sure of it, because I think there are very strong arguments for traditional theism. I think there are very strong arguments for atheism as well. But ultimately, because I don't have enough evidence for one side or the other, I think the authentic and perhaps cold, dark, and I suppose empty universe I find myself in is one where I'm striving to find that meaning, find responsibility, and find value. And that's a difficult task psychologically. And certainly with the Christian view you developed a moment ago, you get certainty, right? You get the ultimate cosmic purpose. You get strong, objective moral values. You get this story of the world in which you sit neatly in the place. Now, just to talk about this for a moment, because I think this is a really interesting point, is that those who are agnostic or like myself or who are atheists, they often say things like, oh, I feel so small in comparison to the rest of the cosmos. Like my life seems so insignificant and meaningless. And you sort of go, well, if you were as big as the world or as big as the sun or as big as the universe, would that make your life more meaningful? And sort of go, no, it wouldn't change it. So size doesn't seem to matter. And then you think, well, maybe it's because I only live for 80 years if I'm lucky. And compared to the 4.5 billion years of our world and the 13.8 of the universe, it seems like my life's meaningless in that context. And you go again, like, imagine you lived for 800,000 years or 8 million years. Does that give your life more meaning? It seems like it doesn't. Now, despite what my ex-girlfriend might tell you, it seems that size and how long you last isn't what's valuable in the context of meaning and purpose. The thing that's meaningful and the thing that we cry out for as agnostics or atheists is what Albert Camus referred to, as you know, as the absurd. We call out for meaning from a universe that's indifferent to us. As the philosopher Michael Houseculler tells us, this version of the absurd threatens to rob us of our sanity. Here be lions and dragons. Here be cold and dark and emptiness. And that's uncomfortable, right? That you don't belong here, or it isn't obvious that you belong here. But I think that's, if we're going to tell ourselves the truth, that search for meaning in a world that doesn't obviously present us meaning is the world that we need to embrace if we're going to live honestly and authentically.
Well, I can tell you what made itself manifest as evidence for me. So the first thing, I'll sort of put a prodroma on this account. And so you know that in the Christian Passion, Christ faces youthful unjust death at the hands of his own people, under the thumb of a tyrant, let's say. And that's not the sum of the injustice of his death, but in some ways that's the essence. And that's a pretty rough account of mortal limitation. But that's not the whole story, because the other encounter that is part and parcel of the Christian Passion is the harrowing of hell. And that's a more mythologized account, let's say, but it has equal existential significance, because the essence of the Christian Passion is it's the transcendent story of the eternal serpent. That's a good way of thinking about it, is that what Christ is encountering is not only the limitations of mortality, but the actuality of evil. Okay, so now, and then you might say as well, and you could say this from a clinical perspective, that it's not possible to live in the world and be complete and grounded and upward striving in the best possible manner without contending with the issue of evil. You have to contend with your mortality, but that's not enough. And it might be that contending with the problem of evil is a deeper problem than contending with the problem of mortality. And that's saying a lot, because the former's no joke. Okay, so when I started my investigations 40 years ago or more, I was obsessed particularly with the problem of evil, and mostly from a psychological perspective. And the question for me, in a nutshell, I suppose, was, what's it like to be an Auschwitz camp guard who enjoys his work? And that's not a question that people usually ask, because they don't conceive of themselves as the sorts of beings who could do that, much less enjoy it. And that always struck me as dangerously naive. Anyways, the consequence of investigating that question was that I became, for whatever it's worth, unshakably convinced that evil was a reality. And maybe in some ways, like an undeniable and fundamental reality, something akin to the reality of pain. Now, what that did for me was highlight out something that was the reverse of that by implication. Because if you can imagine hell in its darkest reaches, you can posit the existence of something that's antithetical to that. Now, it's always been more difficult for me to conceptualize what might be the essence of good than it is to conceptualize the essence of evil. I actually think it's easier in some ways to put your finger on evil. But once you do that, there's an implication that immediately emerges, which is, well, there's some pathway to hell, obviously, since we can create it on earth and have done that repeatedly in our own private lives, say, and sociologically and politically. That strongly implies that there's a pathway in the other direction towards something that's the opposite. And that's been much more difficult to flesh out. But for me, that was the existential grounding of my belief in something approximating a transcendent good. At least the transcendent good is the pathway away from, let's say, the worst excesses of Auschwitz.
Now, this is good, because I'm with you on this. And I think, again, the majority of philosophers,